On behalf of the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana, thank you for joining us for this virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival presentation. This program is Jean Laffite Revealed, Unraveling one of America's longest-running mysteries, with Ashley Oliphant and Beth Yarbrough. Dr. Ashley Oliphant is a recently retired full professor of English with 20 years of college teaching experience. She is the author of 4 books, including Hemingway and Bimini, The Birth of Sport Fishing at the End of the World, Shark Tooth Hunting on the Carolina Coast, and a novel called In Search of Jimmy Buffett, a Key West revival. Her latest project is Jean Laffite Revealed, Unraveling one of America's longest-running mysteries. Beth Yarbrough is a seasoned and successful veteran of the gift and home decor industry, having designed products and licensed her original artwork to the trade for more than 30 years. In 2013, she launched 2 online brands, Southern Voice and Alcott Farm. Her latest venture is a book about Jean Laffite. Together with her co-author Ashley Oliphant, the mother-daughter team sets out to investigate a local legend, only to stumble upon the answer to a 200-year-old mystery. Ladies and gentlemen, Ashley Oliphant and Beth Yarbrough.
My name is Dr. Ashley Oliphant, and I'm a recently retired professor of English and a writer and a speaker. This is my mother. Her name is Beth Yarbrough, and she is an artist and a photographer. You may have seen her work in places like Hobby Lobby and Home Depot and Cracker Barrel and Lowe's. She's worked for 40 years in the giftware industry and the art licensing industry. Most recently, has transitioned to photography and has a new book out called Higher Ground, which chronicles beautiful churches all across the southern part of the United States. I'm a writer of books with topics as varied as sharks and Ernest Hemingway, a novel about Jimmy Buffett. But we are here today to talk to you about a book that was recently released by the University of Louisiana at Lafayette Press. It's called Jean Laffite Revealed, Unraveling one of America's longest running mysteries. And we're excited to be able to talk to you about it today, as you are likely a predominantly Louisiana-based audience. And throughout the research for our book, we came to love the people of New Orleans and especially, but the entire state of Louisiana, and recognized how knowledgeable about Laffite studies most people were. And we were excited to launch this project because nothing really new or innovative has been written about the pirate in I don't know, long about 80 years or so.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, so I initially set out to write a new biography of Laffite from the perspective of a woman, but I had come to learn from my previous research on Ernest Hemingway that even when we're dealing with figures that are very old, if you're willing to dig, there are still new things to find. And it did not take us long in our research process to realize we're stumbling upon some things here that nobody's ever found before. And while I was looking to write a generalized Laffite biography, we found crumbs that led to bigger pieces about Laffite in our own state. We live in Lincolnton, North Carolina, which is just outside of Charlotte. We began to piece together information that while it does not touch the Louisiana timeline, and while it does not alter the Texas Galveston timeline either, sort of fills in the blanks about what happened to Laffite after he left Galveston and sort of went on walkabout in the Gulf. And we were able, through archival research, which was conducted in 7 states, and through the discovery of artifacts that we had analyzed by several experts, to draw the conclusion that Laffite did actually fake his death in the 1820s. He hid for a little bit in Cuba, but then re-entered the United States. And our research allowed us to track him through those states. And that's what we're going to talk to you about today. So before I turn it over to my mom, just a little bit about Laffite. You guys don't need much, I'm sure, but just to understand who he was and why he's a figure I think, who is still worthy of research. He popped up in the New Orleans area around 1805, and those early years, his birth, his boyhood, where that may have been, whether it was France, whether it was Spain, whether it was Haiti, that's all a bit of a mystery. While there are folks who claim to have theories, nobody has theories that are backed up with satisfactory documents. And so that we base our research on what we can determine through primary texts. And so 1805 is when we can place him in Louisiana around Grande Terre. And from there, he and a man named Pierre Laffite, who may or may not have been his brother, built an empire down in the swamps of Barataria, an area that we know has been absolutely devastated in recent weeks by Hurricane Ida. But what they did essentially was amass around 1,000 men under their command and around 100 ships. And the Laffite brothers acted as the middlemen. So when the ships would come in with stolen goods, they would find a market for them and sell them. So at the peak of John Laffite's success, he was one of the 10 wealthiest men in America. A lot of people don't recognize that. Those warehouses he had down in Barataria were housed with millions of dollars of goods, stolen goods. And that dollar figure was in early 1805 or early 1800s money, I should say. So one thing that we do want to acknowledge before we go any further as well is that Laffite was a slave trader on a very large scale. So we don't want to do anything in our research or in our presentations that in any way glorifies a man who stole things, but especially one who whose cargo was human. And there were likely thousands of enslaved people who passed through his operation that were then sold into American slavery. And so that's a big part of who he was, and it needs to be acknowledged in any presentation like this. But Laffite, as you know, very famously assisted the Americans in fighting off the British with Andrew Jackson in command. The Battle of New Orleans is famous in its own right, and historians sort of disagree. How much did Laffite and his men really help? And you can read in our book to sort of see where we fall on all of that. But once he had his camp out in Barataria raided by the local authorities, and once he didn't really get the sort of fame that I think he'd probably been hoping for his participation with the Battle of New Orleans, he and Pierre needed to move the operation. And that's where I'm going to let Beth take over, because that operation moved out west to Galveston, Texas.
So after the battle, they were granted a full pardon by Andrew Jackson, but that pardon, as Ashley said, did not include the restoration of their former wealth, much of which had been seized by New Orleans and Louisiana authorities and had ended up in a good many private pockets. But be that as it may, they were men without a country, so to speak, and needed to find a new place to operate. And Galveston had actually sort of been on their radar already for a couple of years, but they didn't need it as long as Barataria was functioning properly. But once that went away, then they did turn their sights toward Galveston, and for good reason. It had some of the same features. It was readily accessible from the Gulf and was just far enough out of the reach of United States authorities that they felt like maybe they could continue operating without so much pressure. The problem was at Galveston, it turned out to be just a little bit too far away from the markets where they were customarily selling all of their cargo, and unfortunately human cargo as well. So Galveston turned out to be a struggle for them. It lasted a couple of years, but eventually they were run out of Galveston as well and ended up, as Ashley said, on walkabout in the Gulf. We are wandering yet again, and most likely without much money. I'm sure that in fact, history records that they weren't penniless, but they were certainly not at their former level of wealth. So that is where the historic timeline really, really hits the skids. And experts sort of diverge in what they believe happened to the man. You get an awful lot of death theories that conflict with each other. One theory by one expert says, oh, he died here in a gun battle. And another expert, maybe a couple of years later, says, oh, no, I've got documentation. He died of yellow fever here. And so the story went, and it became so fragmented and disjointed that history sort of threw up her hands and said, we don't know. In fact, the Encyclopedia Britannica years ago elected to not give a year or date or place of death because they said, we don't know. That is where we stood when we set out to tell this tale and figure out the truth of what really happened. So one day we had all of these various death theories spread out on a table to count them, number one, but to see if there was some sort of a common thread or whatever. And I remember looking at Ashley and saying, you know what, a man can only die one time. So that renders all the rest of these as not true. And then Ashley said, well, look, if all but one of these is not true, who is to say that all of these are not true? And we're looking at a different story altogether. So we proceeded to continue to research to see what we could unearth. We felt sure that some answers may lie in Cuba for a couple of reasons. Number one, Laffite had shown up in Cuba. He was arrested there a couple of times during the early 1820s after he left Galveston.
He always got away.
Oh, yes, he did. Eternally got away. One of his former best friends, however, Arsène Latour, who many of you as Louisianans know was a prominent figure there. Latour had relocated to Havana and had been living there. And so there was sort of a secure port with a former posse member, if you will, who had the capacity to help hide the man. And so we had suspicions that he had faked his death based on, pick a theory, any theory. There were a lot of them on the table, and that Latour had actually assisted him in going underground. We were reading a biography of Latour that was just recently published within the last 2 or 3 years. And there was a footnote in that biography that claimed a letter from Latour written to Edward Livingston, who is also a familiar name to most of you. He was very prominent in Louisiana politics, ended up going to Washington and serving Andrew Jackson in the Jackson administration. He was also Laffite's former lawyer. You may not have realized that pirates had lawyers, but the Laffites did. And so here's Latour in Havana writing a letter to Livingston in Washington in the year 1829, which do tell that's about 4 or 5 years after the last known death theory had been recorded. So these two men are chatting in this letter, and Latour says, Maison Rouge is still here with me in Havana and needs your help. Now, why would he not call the man by his name? Why use the code name Maison Rouge?
There was nobody named Maison Rouge
alive
or anywhere at the time.
No, but we do know, and any Laffite scholar knows, that there was a large house built by Jean Laffite when he lived in Galveston, very prominent house. He painted it bright red, and it was known far and wide as Maison Rouge. So we became very, very interested in looking at the full content of this letter. However, we found out that it was part of a private collection that resides to this day in France and inaccessible. We could not find it. So plan B was to further investigate Livingston's correspondence to see if maybe there was another Maison Rouge letter. And as luck would have it, there was, and I'm going to turn it over to you to tell that story.
So we got news that Princeton University's library in New Jersey contained the Edward Livingston papers. So we hopped in the car one day and drove there. And I'm not sure if you've ever been to the Princeton Library. It's a serious affair. It took us about an hour to get in order to jump through all of the hoops that they required of us.
And this was pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, had nothing to do with COVID. This was just, these are all the things you've got to do in order to get in, which is understandable because they have one of the greatest collections of stuff in America in an archival library. And so we were digging through boxes, and we'd become, after a year of research, very accustomed to getting in a library and just not talking to each other and plowing through boxes. And she had a box on one side of the room and I had a box on the other. And all of a sudden I heard her gasp audibly and start to say, Maison Rouge, Maison Rouge, Maison Rouge. And she began to shout. They frowned upon shouting in the Princeton University Library. Once I figured out what she had, we both began to jump up and down and cheer, at which point multiple archival librarians from multiple places in the library descended upon us, and we came this close to being thrown out. But we had found an additional Maison Rouge letter that established for us that Jean Laffite in 1829 was very much alive. So the part of this story that we haven't told you yet that's important is that we had suspicions and we're interested in investigating this because in 1839, which is a decade after this Maison Rouge series of letters, a really mysterious man named Lorenzo Ferrer arrived in Lincolnton, North Carolina, where we live. And he lived here from 1839 to 1875. But even the people in his day, his contemporaries, wrote, said, published, whispered, hollered, something is not right about this guy. He is not who he says he is. And one of the reasons for that was he was very wealthy, came to town with reported chests of gold, never worked a day in his life, owned multiple pieces of property, and his story just didn't add up. And so even the people in his day suggested this guy is a pirate. We think he might be Jean Laffite. And so now having Laffite alive up to 1829, we wanted to investigate this Lorenzo Ferrer name as a potential alias. And Laffite was known to use many aliases through his life. But we wanted to see, all right, are all these rumblings in Lincolnton that have persisted to this day, are they legitimate, or can we prove Jean Laffite was alive at the same time a man named Lorenzo Ferrer was, and therefore that the two men couldn't have been the same? What we found, however, is that Lorenzo Ferrer did not emerge in America until 1830. And we have the 1839 Jean Laffite. So Laffite ends in 1829, midway through the year. Early in the year in 1830, this strange man named Lorenzo Ferrer, poof, appears in America. He wasn't born here. He didn't come in through a port. He wasn't born anywhere else. He was a 50-something-year-old man, mid-50s, all of a sudden emerges in Copiah County, Mississippi. And even while he was there, he did not join a church. Nope. He didn't buy a house. He stayed out of the newspaper. Very low profile. But what he did do was something that Jean Laffite knew very well, which was trading enslaved people. We wondered, why would a man who potentially was Jean Laffite wind up in that part of Mississippi at that time? And the answer is the cotton boom. In the very early 1830s, it was just getting ramped up. And there was major money to be made in land speculating on lands that had just recently been opened up for sale by the United States, stolen from native peoples, but as well the trading of enslaved people, because as the plantation economy ramped up, there was a perceived need for labor. And so Jean Laffite knew how to make money, and he knew how to place himself in an area where that money could be made quickly. And so that's the reason why we believe that this continue to believe this Lorenzo Ferrer character very well could have been him. And so a couple of interesting things happened in those Mississippi years. He ended up getting married Really short-lived marriage to a very young girl, the 17-year-old daughter of a very prominent businessman in the town where Ferrer was living. And he was 54, 55, 56, somewhere in that age. She was 17. Their marriage didn't last very long, less than 2 years, we know, because she was already married to somebody else by then. We believe there is the potential that her family found out who Lorenzo Ferrer really was, and he was asked to leave town and never come back. So that marriage was never, there was no divorce, and there was never an annulment. It just, they just didn't do it anymore. And so Ferrer ended up going north, and I'll let my mom tell you about that in just a second. But while he was in Copiah County, Mississippi, which is right around the Jackson area, we found a document that really helped put all of the pieces together of our research. In the year 1831, Lorenzo Ferrer entered into a contract with a man named George Brewer. This document is housed in Nacogdoches, Texas, but it occurred in Mississippi. Ferrer loaned an enslaved woman, a young girl, age 17, named Louisa, to George Brewer for the period of 1 year. Couple of things may have been happening here. One, Ferrer may have needed to travel possibly internationally and did not want to take Louisa with him. The other more sinister possibility is that it was not uncommon, though not necessarily common practice for at the time when it was illegal to import enslaved people in the United States, for slave owners to contract with other slave owners to force enslaved people to produce a child that would then be born into slavery. And so in considering and speaking with historians about those possibilities and considering that, it's heartbreaking to think what that document may represent for Louisa's experience in life. But that document helped us connect the Louisa in Mississippi to the Louisa that came with Ferrer to Lincolnton when he arrived here in 1839. It's almost as if this young woman who had no voice in her lifetime was likely born into slavery and died in slavery. It's almost like she raised her hand to us with that document and said, "Hey girls, this is him and I'm the link. Look at my age on my tombstone in Lincolnton. Look at my age on this document. It matches up. I'm the same Louisa. He's the same Lorenzo Ferrer." And so I'll let Beth tell you about Ferrer's move north to another part of Mississippi.
So a couple of counties north of Copiah is a county named Madison, Mississippi, and the county seat was Canton. Ferrer ended up there, and we traced him there via documents, tax records, land records, this kind of thing. And so he was there, still flying under the radar. The Lorenzo Ferrer behavior that we recorded and found in Mississippi is starkly different from the behavior of the very same man after he arrived in North Carolina. And we'll get there in just a second. But we're going to tell you how he made the leap from Mississippi to North Carolina. And that was a very interesting connection all its own. At that time in Canton, Mississippi, there were 3 brothers named Henderson who had come to that area of the country for the same reason a lot of people had, which was the cotton boom. Money is quite the magnet and was in that day. And so these men had come there for the very same reason. And one of those brothers was named James Pinckney Henderson. He ended up going on to become the first governor of Texas. And while he was there in Canton, he made a mark for himself by giving fiery speeches on the courthouse square and in public spaces, advocating for the cause of Texas independence and trying to rally local militia to go down and help in that fight. So it's 99 and 44/100% a certainty that Lorenzo Ferrer, who is recorded as having done business out of the very same land offices as these 3 men, made their acquaintance and knew exactly who they were. Now, here is the thing about those Henderson brothers. There were actually 10 of them, and they were born in Lincoln County, North Carolina, which is the county where Lincolnton is the county seat. So Lorenzo Ferrer ended up in Lincolnton, North Carolina in 1839, not because he just threw a dart at a map and said, where do I go from here? He came here because of his relationship with the Henderson brothers. So the cotton boom, as these things tend to do, went bust somewhere around 1836, 37, 38. And a very strong talent and a hallmark of Jean Laffite's life was that he knew how to spot trouble before it found him. So he apparently made his exit from Mississippi just ahead of the disaster and arrived in North Carolina within a year or two of that, with Louisa by his side, and as Ashley mentioned, enough money to last him the rest of his life. He never worked a day for the next 35 years. And ended up dying at the age of 96. So now we have him in Lincolnton solidly, and I will let you pick up the trail from there.
Yeah, so while he was here, he came out of his shell. We believe that happened because he felt like he had the cover of the Hendersons, and as well, he was beginning to be an older man, and he physically likely did not look like he did as a young man down in the Gulf. And I think he began to realize, hey, the coast is clear. I can sort of live more freely. So he bought property. He's in the newspaper. Now he's giving toasts on the public square. He helps to found a Freemason lodge. He and Louisa are very prominent members of a local church. In fact, both of them are buried at that location, St. Luke's Episcopal in Lincolnton. Louisa preceded Ferrer in death by about 30 years. So Ferrer lived the last part of his life alone in that regard. He and Louisa, she was always in Lincolnton, passed off as his housekeeper, but everyone in town knew that she was his mistress. That's another character trait about Jean Laffite that carries us back through time, that allows us to make the connection. Jean Laffite, and by all accounts, always had a beautiful mixed-race woman with him, young mixed-race woman with him. Even it didn't matter what location of the country he was in. And so Louisa really represents that connection. But I mentioned the Freemasons, and that is really where our big break came. We had almost finished, in fact, we had finished writing the manuscript. University of Louisiana Press was ready to go. We had, actually, and I'm not sure how this all came together, it's kind of miraculous. We knocked, quite literally, knocked on the door of the local Freemason Lodge in Lincolnton, Lincoln Lodge 137, because we had learned through a local historian that Lorenzo Ferrer may have been Freemason. They are a secretive group of fellas who usually don't take kindly to women they don't know asking to come in and see their records. But somehow, miraculously, they agreed to take a vote. It had to be unanimous to allow us to come in and look at their records, their ledger book in particular, which documented all of their meeting minutes and all the records of anybody who's ever been a Freemason in that lodge. Those records date back to 1852, when that lodge was founded. A very small handful of men, very prominent though, in Lincolnton were the founders. Lorenzo Ferrer was one of them. So we had the very rare opportunity through researching that archive to learn so much about early Lincoln County history, so much about the Freemason organization, though they don't write their secrets down. That's one of the reasons we were allowed to come in. Though we did get to sneak a peek at the meeting chamber, which was kind of cool. But in any event, we got to learn about all kinds of financial scandals, interpersonal scandals that were happening in Lincolnton. And a lot of that dirty business was filtered through the lodge at the time.
And involved a former pirate.
So it was interesting to say the least. And so we had finished writing the manuscript. We had enough evidence in our hand to feel really good about laying the claim in this book that Lorenzo Ferrer was Jean Laffite. And about a week or two after, probably 2 weeks after we'd finished research, and we got a call from one of the brothers who had been instrumental in helping us to get in. And he said, we found something up here. We think you need to come and take a look. And so interest obviously peaked. We come in, and there is, if you want to find the picture in the book, they had a sword and a scabbard, an old one, laid out on the table. And they said, look what we have. And we said, okay, that's a pretty cool old sword. And so the book, you can see up a little bit. The book has many pictures that you can take a look at the sword and get close-ups. But they said, this is our Tyler sword. And at that point, we needed an education about what that meant. And so we'll offer that to you in case you don't know. A Tyler is a position in the Freemason Lodge, an important one. It's one of the ones that's not elected. It's a position that the master of the lodge determines how it's going to be filled. But that Tyler stands at the door of the meetings to ensure that nobody comes in without authorization. And so if you are a visiting brother from another lodge, it's the Tyler's job before you get into the meeting chamber to sort of vet you, so to speak. To put you through the paces and make sure that you know all of the code words and the handshakes, quite literally. And he stands there with a sword. Now, I don't think they have ever hit people with the sword. It's a metaphor. It's not a I'm going to hit you with my sword sort of situation. But that sword stands as a metaphor for guarding the secrets, right? And so they bring it down during certain ceremonies, but that meeting chamber is pretty dark. And so what we sort of learned from talking to them is nobody's really ever paid much attention to it. Nobody's taken it off the wall to look at it. So we did that. Turns out that sword was a cavalry saber from the War of 1812, manufactured by a man named Nathan Starr, one of the preeminent sword makers of the day. He had been contracted by the U.S. government to make 5,000 swords for the War of 1812. We know that the Battle of New Orleans, which culminated in 1815, was the end of that. This sword was in the second run. It was manufactured between 1812 and 1813. We know it was the second run because the scabbard is iron instead of leather. But having all of these details, which we were able to verify with an expert, was really neat because we're like, okay, we've got a period-specific sword here. None of the founding members have connections to the War of 1812, but one that we know of. And so this is a neat thing. There's a chance that Lorenzo Ferrer was the one who donated it. And so hooray us, we found something cool. I could not sleep that night because I realized that I may have held a pirate sword, and my wheels just spun all night long. And I woke up that morning and called her and I said, we need to see if they will let us into the lodge one more time. I don't feel like we looked really well at the scabbard, and there may be something there that we missed. And so we called them and begged, one more time, please. Every time we re-entered the lodge, it had to be by unanimous vote. And so they let us in one more time. This time we came equipped with a black light. And we turned all of the lights in the lodge out. I had my cell phone camera, my flashlight on, plus we had the black light. One of the youngest brothers in the lodge, his name's Lyndon Berry, his face was down closest, and we all began to scan the scabbard together. At the same time, we all saw what was clearly an inscription. You needed the black light to see it really well. And we said, all right, Lyndon, your face is closest. Tell us what you see. Keep in mind, Lyndon had not done any of the research we had. Lyndon didn't know what he was supposed to be looking for. He read what he saw. And he said, I see a capital J. I see a lowercase n. And then I see a space. And then I see a capital L. And we didn't need to hear any more letters because we knew what the remaining letters were going to be. They were A, F, F, I, T, E, just as Jean Laffite always spelled his name. He never wrote Jean, J-E-A-N out. He always abbreviated in every known signature to J-N, Laffite. And it was spelled the way he spelled it, 2 F's and 1 T. And so we lost our minds and realized
not that we hadn't already.
Yeah. But we were really over the edge at that point because we realized that the Freemasons had a sword, a period-specific sword with Jean Laffite's hand-etched signature on the scabbard. They had no idea in the lodge that Lorenzo Ferrer helped to found in 1852. Now, with this information, we knew we couldn't just come out with a book and say, look, we've got the sword, because we knew there were going to be a lot of people that would be naysayers. They would be skeptical. Oh, you just planted that there. Oh, you put the inscription on there. There's no way this is legitimate. So we did our due diligence before the book was published. We consulted with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Smithsonian, Colonial Williamsburg. They helped us to locate the best experts to determine what we were looking at. And that expert was an antique metals expert who had a really high-powered microscope, and he was able to verify some important things for us. Number one, the signature was just as we had seen it, spelled the way we had. And he was able to determine that it was an old signature, likely as old as the sword itself, because it had been covered at some point by a very heavy coat of oil or varnish to protect the sword in general. And that oil had seeped down into the cracks and made that inscription very hard to see. So that's the reason why nobody at the lodge had really seen it before. You needed a black light and a flashlight and the lights out. And so the expert was able to determine that varnish was extraordinarily old too. So there was no way that inscription could have been made recently. And as well, we learned from the Freemasons that, or we had read the minutes of those meetings, and they were absolutely meticulous.
They were.
Every shred of paper that ever entered that lodge through donation was documented. We would see things like brother so-and-so donated 4 candles, but one of them was broken. So it was really only 3.5 candles. But that sword is not mentioned in the minutes as being donated. And so we talked to the brothers about that, and they said the reason for that is likely that it was donated as the lodge was coming together, but before it was official. Therefore, there were no meeting minutes being taken. So they said this thing was donated by a founding member. Mm-hmm. We investigated those founding members. There's only a handful of them. None of them have War of 1812 connections. There's no reason anybody else would have donated that sword. And you certainly can't discount the signature being there as a very powerful piece of evidence. And so we'll wrap up here, but we can close just to say that we continue to investigate. We are working on a sequel to this book because we continue to find new information. We know there's more in Cuba. There's more in Mississippi, and there's more in North Carolina. In fact, we formed the Jean Laffite Historical Society in Lincolnton, and just in the first week or so of its founding, we were able to locate what we believe is a young man named Vatinius, who was the son of Lorenzo Ferrer and Louisa in Lincolnton. And so we believe we now have a descendant and are following those trails to see what else that information can tell us. But we continue to be astonished by what we found. We had a great time researching, and I think sort of anybody who's crossed our path in that project probably remembers, because we were in and out of a lot of places on two wheels. But it's exciting, and I think I'll close just by saying that history, as we know it, can continue to evolve. It just takes people who are willing to look in unexpected places. The vast majority of what we found that turned out to be of importance was uncatalogued and undigitized. It just required us to be in the right place, to know where that right place was, and to be willing to spend 2 or 3 days digging in a dusty spider-infested basement, if that's what it took.
And we did that.
We did that, yeah. Raymond, Mississippi. You never forget that.
Beautiful courthouse.
Beautiful. But history, there's more to find, and we're really excited to be on the trail of a very interesting, despicable but interesting man, and the journey continues. Thank you, and if you have any questions, you can reach us at jeanlaffiterevealed@gmail.com, and that's Laffite. You can also purchase the book on Amazon, or if you purchase through our website, your book will come autographed, and it can be purchased at jeanlaffiterevealed.com. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this presentation of the virtual 2021 Louisiana Book Festival. Please visit our official bookseller, Cavalier House Books, and receive 20% off all featured festival titles through the end of the year. A special thank you to our festival sponsors. The Louisiana Book Festival will return on October 29th, 2022.